The summer of 1981 smothered Kentucky in a heat that clung to the skin and slowed every breath. The kind of weather that made people leave their doors unlocked and trust the world a little too much. Parents let their children roam the neighborhood on their bikes, convinced their town was safe, a place where danger belongs somewhere else. But on one June evening, that trust was shattered so violently that Lexington would never recover. Because a 16-year-old girl, full of life, full of plans, full of every bright possibility, set out on her sky blue bicycle and never made it home. No warning, no sound, no chance to fight back. One moment she was pedaling down Richmond Road, and minutes later, she was gone, taken out of her own life as if she didn't matter, as if her family didn't matter, as if her future meant nothing. People talk about tragedy as if time softens it, but that isn't true. The families left behind don't get to move on. They don't get to forget. For them, the moment she vanished replayed over and over for 40 long years, a wound that refused to close, a question that refused to fade. What cut deepest was this: the person responsible wasn't some shadowy stranger hiding far away. He walked among them, smiled at them, lived close enough to hear the sirens when the search began. A man who blended into the town so well that no one ever looked at him twice. This was the kind of betrayal that turns a whole community cold inside. As the sun went down that night, families sat on their porches, unaware that one of their own had already been pulled into a nightmare. Search teams rushed through fields, voices cracking as they called her name, while her parents stood on the roadside begging for any sign of their daughter. The panic in that town felt like a weight pressing down on everyone, a reminder that safety can disappear in a single heartbeat. What terrified people most wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. No struggle, no tracks leading anywhere useful, no clue that pointed toward a reason. Her sky blue bicycle was eventually discovered, tossed aside, and as though her life held no value. That single detail cut through the community like a blade, because whoever did this moved with purpose. Calm, quiet, confident enough to walk straight into a neighborhood full of families and steal a child without hesitation. 40 years is a long time to carry that kind of hurt. A long time for parents to wake up every morning knowing the world went on while their daughter didn't come home. But here's the part many people ignore. Cases like this don't stay buried because they're unsolvable. They stay buried because most people look away, hoping someone else will care enough to keep asking questions. If you're the kind of viewer who clicks off before the truth comes out, understand this. It's that same silence that lets predators stay free. So either stay with us or ask yourself why you'd walk away from a story this important. Because the truth didn't fade. It waited. For decades, Lexington carried this pain like a shadow that clung to every anniversary, every unanswered question, every family gathering with an empty chair no one dared acknowledge out loud. Children who grew up hearing the story became adults who still locked their doors at sunset. Parents whispered warnings to their kids, not out of caution, but out of fear born from a wound that never healed. Because when a child is stolen, the whole town loses something. Its trust, its safety, its belief that danger gives warnings. It doesn't. People aged, lives changed, but the memory of that missing girl didn't loosen its grip. Even those who never met her knew the story. They knew her name. They knew the ache her family carried. And deep down, everyone suspected the same unbearable truth. The person who took her wasn't far. He wasn't a ghost. He walked the same streets, attended the same gatherings, smiled at the same people who spent nights searching for a child he knew would never be found alive. That realization that the threat lived among them while they slept peacefully at night was the kind of truth that can leave a town broken long after the headlines fade. And just when everyone thought the answers were lost forever, something stirred. A spark, a clue, a reminder that time doesn't erase guilt. It only waits for the right moment to expose it. They thought the truth died in 1981. They were wrong. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Before her name became a headline, before her disappearance reshaped an entire city, Marlene Foster was simply a teenager trying to find her place in the world. 16 years old, full of that restless mix of hope and courage that every parent prays their child gets to carry into adulthood. She had a laugh that made people turn their heads, not because it was loud, but because it was joyful in a way that felt rare. She wanted to work with animals, spent weekends volunteering at a small local shelter, and talked endlessly about the future she believed she'd reach. Her room was covered in drawings, photos, and tiny notes she wrote to herself. Reminders to study harder, save money, be brave, and never give up. She wasn't perfect. She had bad days and teenage moods and moments where she argued with her parents. But she was alive, and she was pushing through life with all the clumsy energy of someone who had no idea her time was running out. Her parents, Linda and Robert, worked long hours but always made time for her. They trusted her. They believed in her. They believed their daughter would walk through the front door every evening, complaining about homework or asking what was for dinner. That trust was ordinary, normal, the kind every family depends on without even realizing it. They didn't know their daughter's final day had already begun. They didn't know the world they built around her was about to collapse in a way no parent should ever experience. On the morning of June 18th, 1981, Marlene left home with the same easy confidence she always had. She hugged her mom, promised she wouldn't be out late, and pedaled off toward her friend's house with her sky blue bicycle glinting in the sun. Nothing about that day felt unusual. No strange phone calls, no warnings. No sense that danger had already chosen its moment. That was part of the pain. Everything looked normal until the world cracked open. Her friends remembered her as the one who always tried to keep the group together. She was the peacekeeper, the listener, the friend who held everyone else's secrets, even when she struggled with her own. She talked about college, about wanting to travel, about maybe leaving Kentucky for a while just to see what life looked like in other places. She believed she had time. Everyone believed she did. When her friends were asked later about her last visit, they spoke through tears. They mentioned how she laughed that day, how she teased one of them about a crush, how she leaned her bike against the porch railing without locking it. Something she always did because she trusted her surroundings. She wasn't careless. She was simply a child in a town that convinced her she was safe. As the sun dropped that evening and she rode toward home, no one could have imagined they were seeing her for the last time. Her life was still moving forward. Her dreams were still intact. And somewhere nearby, someone was already waiting to take everything from her. As the hours passed that night, her parents began to sense something was wrong long before they admitted it out loud. A mother knows when her child is late for the wrong reasons. A father feels it in his chest when a promise made that morning hasn't been kept. They called her friends, one by one, their voices tightening with every "I haven't seen her" since earlier. By the time they called the police, fear had already settled in like a weight neither of them could shake off. The officers tried to calm them, told them she was probably delayed, probably distracted, probably somewhere safe. But her parents knew better. They knew their daughter. They knew she wouldn't disappear on purpose. Every minute felt like an hour. Every passing car sounded like it might be her. And every silence after shouting her name into the night made the truth harder to ignore. When her bicycle was found days later, tossed aside in a patch of woods miles from her planned route, her parents broke in a way words cannot capture. That bicycle had carried her through childhood. It held memories of scraped knees and summer days and countless trips home. Seeing it abandoned felt like a message, one that crushed any remaining hope they were trying to hold on to. Friends, teachers, neighbors, everyone felt the loss. Not just because Marlene was missing, but because her absence changed something in them. It reminded every parent that safety wasn't promised. It reminded every teenager that life could be taken without warning. And it reminded the entire community that someone among them had done the unthinkable. The first hour after Marlene missed her curfew felt like nothing more than parental worry. Her parents tried to reassure each other, telling themselves she was probably chatting too long with a friend or taking the long way home on her bicycle. But the clock kept moving, and their unease kept growing. Every ring of the phone startled them. Every car door outside made them hope she was finally back. When the neighborhood lights dimmed and their daughter still wasn't home, The panic hit them in full. Linda grabbed the house phone with shaking hands, calling every friend she could think of. Each response was the same. She left earlier. She should have been home by now. Meanwhile, Robert grabbed his keys and drove the roads they knew she'd take, checking every corner, every sidewalk, every familiar route she usually followed. The silence of that night clung to him in a way he never forgot. When the police finally arrived, the questions came fast. Where was she headed? Did she often stay out late? Did she seem upset lately? Every question felt like a slap, not because they were harsh, but because the parents didn't have the answers the officers needed. They couldn't point to a problem, an argument, a reason. Nothing fit. Everything about her day had been normal. Within the first 2 hours, neighbors joined the search. Flashlights swept across yards. Cars crawled along streets with windows down as people shouted her name. Groups moved through the nearby park, calling into the dark. Her parents were out there too, walking until their legs trembled, screaming her name until their voices cracked. The pain of not finding even a scrap of evidence turned their fear into something heavier. By dawn, more than 50 volunteers had shown up. It wasn't just concern, it was shock. This was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, a place where kids rode bikes without second-guessing who might be watching. For a child to vanish without a single sound or struggle felt impossible. That impossibility, however, didn't bring Marlene back. Flyers were printed and handed out at gas stations, grocery stores, schools. Her photo was posted on power poles and taped to shop windows. Her smile stared back at anyone who looked long enough. Warm, bright, full of life. Seeing her face everywhere only made the situation feel more unreal. How could a girl so full of light simply disappear? But the worst part of those first hours wasn't the lack of clues. It was the moment when her parents, exhausted and terrified, understood what the officers were trying not to say out loud. She wasn't just late, she was missing. By the second day of the all, Lexington no longer felt like the same town. The air carried a heaviness that settled into every conversation, every doorstep, every passing glance between neighbors. People stopped assuming Marlene would turn up with an explanation. Hope was still there, but it was fragile, shrinking by the hour. The official search expanded. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder across open fields, checking barns, overgrown trails, drainage areas, and abandoned sheds. Local churches opened their doors to volunteers, offering water, maps, and places to regroup. Groups were assigned routes. Some searched on foot, others used bikes, ATVs, or pickup trucks to cover more ground. Everyone was desperate to be the one to find something, anything that could point toward where she had gone. But every path, every creek bed, every wooded patch ended the same. Nothing. The officers leading the effort tried to keep morale up, but their tone said everything. They were struggling. They had no signs of a struggle, no dropped belongings, no footprints that made sense. It was as if she'd been lifted out of her own life without leaving so much as a mark behind. That kind of disappearance was rare, almost unheard of in a place like this. On the third day, a tip came from a delivery driver named Silas Kent. He claimed he'd seen a dark-colored sedan idling near a wooded area off a small road not far from where Marlene's bike route passed. He mentioned it casually, almost apologetically, worried he might be wasting their time. Still, the officers listened. When they pressed him for a description or a partial plate number, his memory blurred. It had been evening, the light was fading, and he admitted he hadn't paid much attention. His uncertainty was obvious, but the officers followed up anyway. They checked the area he described. They searched the woods. They scanned the roadside ditches and the entrance to the old lumber mill. The deeper they pushed into those woods, the more uneasy the volunteers became. It was quiet, too quiet, and the thick brush made visibility nearly impossible. Still, they walked the area in wide arcs, calling her name into the stillness. And then someone spotted it. Her sky-blue bicycle lay on its side, half hidden among tangled vines and fallen branches. The frame was dusty, the tires flattened, and the seat slightly crooked. For a brief moment, the discovery brought a rush of relief. Finally, a sign. Finally, something real. But as officers gathered around it, their relief turned to confusion. There were no marks on the ground, No broken branches suggesting a struggle. No signs that she fell or crashed. No fingerprints on the handlebars. No footprints around it that matched her shoes. The bicycle was intact but stripped of anything useful, almost as if someone made sure it would reveal nothing. When the officer radioed in the discovery, Marlene's parents collapsed into each other. Finding the bicycle didn't answer their questions. It made everything worse, because now they knew where her bike had ended up, but they still had no idea where she was. The discovery of the bicycle should have been a turning point, but instead it became the moment investigators realized just how far they were from the truth. The condition of the bike was strange, almost spotless, free of the dirt and scratches you'd expect from being dragged into the woods. The officers inspected it carefully, hoping for even the smallest trace they could warrant it with. But the handlebars were smooth, the frame free of handprints, and the seat held no fibers that could point toward what happened. Whoever left it there knew exactly what they were doing. Detective Elias Vance, one of the first to take over the case, stepped back from the scene with a frustrated look on his face. He didn't say much, but his silence said enough. This wasn't a simple runaway case. This wasn't an accident. This was something planned by someone who moved confidently, someone who understood how to leave nothing behind. Still, the officers pushed on. They scoured the woods around the lumber mill, searching for broken twigs, discarded items, or any signs she might have passed through. Teams moved outward in widening circles. Dogs were brought in, but the trail faded almost immediately. The heat, the terrain, and the passing days had erased everything that could have helped them. Back in town, fear had already taken hold. Parents who once let their kids ride freely now kept them indoors. Teenagers traveled in groups, glancing over their shoulders every few minutes. Rumors spread through the community. Some said they saw a stranger near the gas station days earlier. Others swore a car had been following young girls near the park. None of it matched. None of it led anywhere. The interviews piled up. Friends repeated the same timeline. Teachers gave what they could, though none of it was helpful. The police even tracked down a transient man who had been passing through the area that week. They questioned him for hours, but his alibi held up, and he was quickly cleared. Every lead fell apart the moment they tried to follow it. Detective Vance spent long nights at his desk, staring at the growing stack of reports, statements, and maps marked with circles and arrows that led nowhere. He wore the case heavily, and the team could see the stress pulling at him. Each passing week chipped away at the slim chance of finding Marlene alive. Every dead end felt like a personal failure. By late summer, the emotional strain had settled over Lexington like a fog that refused to lift. The officers, the volunteers, the families, they all felt it. A growing, unspoken dread that the person responsible wasn't far away, that this was someone who lived among them, moved through their streets, and watched their children as if nothing had changed. On September 3rd, after weeks with no progress, the case was officially logged and labeled. File 3181-0618. A number, a date, a reminder of a girl whose life had vanished without a sound. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the truth was settling in. The case was slipping into the dark. By the time autumn arrived, the investigation had shifted from urgent action to painful routine. Every morning, Detective Vance walked into the station hoping someone had called in with a breakthrough. Every evening, he walked out carrying the same weight he started the day with. It wasn't just frustration. It was the feeling that time itself was working against them. The longer Marlene stayed missing, the louder the silence around her became. He revisited the bicycle more times than he could count. It sat in the evidence room, leaned gently against a metal rack as though waiting to be picked up again. He stared at it often, searching for something he must have missed. Something so small it didn't make sense at the time. But every inspection ended the same way, with the same emptiness he felt the day it was found. The team tried to push forward. Officers re-interviewed anyone who might have crossed paths with Marlene that evening. They spoke again with Silas Kent, hoping something new would come to him, a memory sharpened by guilt or fear. But Silas's story never changed. A car, dark-colored, idling, nothing more, nothing useful. In a last effort before reducing the search, the team expanded their radius, checking neighboring counties for any reports matching Marlene's description. Some families called in with sightings that raised brief hope, But each one collapsed once details were checked. Wrong hair color, wrong age, wrong clothing. Every false alarm chipped away at the spirit of the people searching for her. Eventually, the task force that once filled entire rooms shrank to a handful of officers and volunteers who refused to let go. Day after day, they sat with maps spread across the table, tracing the same routes, revisiting the same dead ends, trying to force meaning out of fragments that simply didn't connect. The case had no pattern, no motive, no direction, and while the police wrestled with their shrinking options, the community carried its own burden. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone. Schools added extra supervision. Parents who once waved from porches now walked their kids to the bus stop with tight grips and anxious glances. The trust that held the neighborhood together had cracks in it now. Wide, painful cracks. Whispers spread through Lexington. People pointed fingers. Some blamed strangers passing through town. Others blamed neighbors they never really liked. Old grudges ignited into accusations. None of it helped the investigation, but it revealed the fear simmering under the surface. Fear that the person responsible had never left. Fear that he still blended in with the same ease he always had. Detective Vance felt it too. He didn't show it, but it was there, in the way he lingered over the case file, in the way he stayed late even when nothing new had come in the way his eyes grew tired when he admitted they were running out of options. By the end of the year, the truth became harder to ignore. They were losing the trail, and Marlene was still gone. Winter settled over Lexington with a coldness that felt personal, like the season itself was mourning alongside the family. Search efforts slowed, not because anyone stopped caring, but because there was simply nothing left to chase. Every lead had burned out. Every promising clue had collapsed under scrutiny. Every theory fell apart the moment officers tried to apply it to the facts. It was as though the earth had swallowed every trace of Marlene whole. Detective Vance hated the silence most of all. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of answers. The kind of silence that hangs over an empty chair at dinner or a closed bedroom door no one has had the strength to open. He visited the Foster home more often than his reports required, partly to update the parents, partly because he couldn't stand the idea of leaving them in the dark. Each visit made him feel more helpless than the last. Their eyes carried a question he couldn't answer, no matter how desperately he wanted to. The official timeline grew painfully short. Days had turned into weeks, weeks into months. The hopes of finding her alive dimmed until even the most optimistic voices in the community spoke in quiet, broken tones. News crews stopped coming. Volunteers returned to work. Even the flyers, once crisp and bright, faded in the sun until the edges curled and the ink blurred. Inside the station, the case file thickened. Not with progress, but with interviews, maps, reports, and statements that all pointed toward nothing. Officers debated every detail, searching for a connection they might have missed. A coincidence that wasn't a coincidence. A comment someone brushed off too quickly. A tiny moment with meaning hidden inside it. But every path led back to the same wall. The feeling of defeat seeped into the entire department. Younger officers avoided eye contact when the case was mentioned. Older officers pulled Vance aside to remind him that some cases stay unsolved. He refused to accept that, yet even he couldn't ignore what the evidence screamed. They had no suspect, no motive, no direction. It was a disappearance without a trail, a crime without a shape. Meanwhile, the neighborhood tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy, but the illusion never fully returned. Parents escorted their children everywhere. Teenagers no longer wandered after sunset. Even everyday routines felt different, heavier, slower, guarded. People didn't just watch their surroundings, they questioned them. By early 1982, the department made a decision that felt like a betrayal to everyone who loved Marlene, but it was one they could no longer avoid. The active search would be scaled back. The team would dissolve. The file would remain open, but without new evidence, there was nothing left to pursue. Detective Vance signed the final log entry with a shaking hand. He stared at the case number, 3181-06108, and felt an ache that stayed with him for the rest of his career. A number should never be all that remained of a girl's life. But for now, that was all they had. By the time spring returned to Kentucky, the posters had thinned from the storefront windows. Not out of choice, but because the weather had peeled them away. The bright smile on Marlene's missing flyer, the smile everyone once recognized instantly, had faded into a ghostly outline. Some neighbors kept the original copies pinned to their refrigerators, hoping their presence might somehow bring her home. Others couldn't bear to look at them anymore. The pain was too sharp, too raw, too constant. Detective Vance still carried her file everywhere. It sat on his desk even when he was working other cases, like a weight he refused to set down. He reread every statement, every map, every timeline until he knew them by heart. Part of him hoped that if he stared long enough, something new would appear. Something he missed in the early days. Something small enough to be overlooked, but powerful enough to bring answers. But the pages never changed. The report stayed empty. The truth refused to give itself away. His colleagues noticed the toll. He spoke less, slept less, ate meals that went untouched. He carried himself like a man waging war against a shadow he couldn't land a punch on. Every missing detail was a bruise he felt personally. Every dead end was a reminder that time wasn't just slipping. It was pushing her case further into the dark. Meanwhile, the Foster family lived a different kind of agony. Their home was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. Marlene's bedroom remained untouched, her belongings placed exactly where she left them. Her mother walked past the door every morning, pausing, hoping the doorknob might turn, hoping her daughter might walk out with an excuse about losing track of time or running late. But the door never moved. The silence in that hallway felt colder than the winter they had just survived. Community life slowly resumed, but nothing felt right. Parents still glanced out windows every time their child stepped onto a porch. Teenagers memorized the quickest routes home. Families avoided the wooded area near the lumber mill entirely, not because of proof, but because of fear born from unanswered questions. Trust had been carved out of the town, leaving a hollow space where certainty used to live. Eventually, the department gave the order that no one wanted to hear, but everyone expected. The investigation would be filed as a cold case. Not closed, not forgotten, just frozen, waiting for a miracle that no one could see coming. Detective Vance carried the file to the evidence room himself. He placed it gently on the shelf, right between other cases that had also grown cold over the years. But his hand lingered, his eyes stung. He whispered something under his breath, a promise maybe, before turning away. And as the door closed behind him, it felt like the town exhaled a long, defeated breath. The hunt for answers had stopped. The trail had vanished. And Marlene's story slipped into silence. 40 years is a long time to carry a wound without answers. Generations grew up hearing about Marlene's disappearance, yet no one expected the case to ever reopen. It had been passed around so many desks, stored on so many shelves, and mentioned in so many hushed conversations that most people assumed the truth was buried for good. But in early 2021, Lexington made a decision that changed the course of this story forever. A new department had been formed, the Lexington Cold Case Initiative, built around the belief that forgotten cases still deserved a chance. Funded with updated equipment and staffed by investigators trained in modern forensic methods. The unit existed for one purpose: bring justice to families who had waited far too long. Among the new team was Detective Alana Dubois. Younger than many of the long-serving officers but known for her sharp focus, she had a reputation for refusing to let details slip by her. She didn't rely on hunches or instinct. She trusted evidence, process, and the kind of patience required to sift through cases older than she was. When she read the Foster file for the first time, she didn't skim it. She studied it with the care of someone who understood what it meant to reopen old wounds. The condition of the bicycle and the crime scene photos bothered her, not because of what she saw, but because of what she didn't. No prints, no debris, no trace pointing toward who handled it. That level of cleanliness wasn't normal. Not for a teenager's bike. Not for an item abandoned outdoors. She requested every piece of preserved evidence tied to the case. And when the bicycle arrived at the lab, she stood over it in silence for a moment. 4 decades. That's how long it had waited. That's how long justice had been stalled. She knew the original team had reached the limits of their era's technology. She also knew her team now had tools they could only dream of back then. The lab was equipped with high-resolution imaging, advanced chemical testing, and extraction methods designed to detect samples invisible to the human eye. For the first time since 1981, the bicycle wasn't just an artifact. It was a possible source of truth. A technician slowly removed the seat covering and began examining the underside, a place the original investigation never had reason to check. Under magnification, something thin and unnatural caught the light. A tiny thread, barely visible, lodged deep within the fabric. Synthetic, not cotton, not wool, not anything Marlene would have worn. A detail so small it could only have survived because the bike had been stored under controlled conditions for decades. Dubois leaned in. "Bag it," she said quietly. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, but for the first time in this case, something new had surfaced. Something untouched by time. Something no one had noticed in 1981. And she wasn't about to let it slip away. The discovery of the tiny synthetic thread changed the energy in the lab instantly. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was the first physical sign that someone had touched that bicycle besides Marlene. A thread that didn't belong to her. A thread that didn't match her clothing, her backpack, or anything listed in the original property logs. It was a whisper of contact, evidence the 1981 team couldn't have seen even if they tried. But Detective Dubois wasn't satisfied with just one breakthrough. She believed that if one detail had survived, there might be more hiding in plain sight. She ordered a complete teardown of the bike using updated forensic procedures, precision lighting angles, trace chemical testing, and micro-level inspections across every surface. Hours into the process, a lab tech paused, leaning closer to the underside of one of the handlebar grips. There, clinging to a section of the rubber that had escaped past cleanings, was something the size of a grain of dust. It was faint, fragile, almost colorless. The kind of biological trace that could have been lost 100 times over the years, during storage, transport, or simple handling. But somehow it had endured. The tech called out quietly. Dubois approached, her chest tightening with something she refused to name yet. Not hope, but possibility. They ran an initial examination. The result wasn't much, only confirmation that the sample might contain epithelial cells, skin cells left behind by the touch of another person. Dubois didn't hesitate. She authorized a full extraction, knowing well that degraded samples often crumbled during the attempt. But doing nothing would have been worse. Too many families had already lost decades to that kind of hesitation. The hours waiting for the extraction felt like days. She paced the hallway, checking updates, reviewing the Foster file again, mentally preparing herself for disappointment. Most samples from that era dissolved before yielding anything useful. She had prepared herself for that outcome. She had told the team to prepare for it too. But when the results finally came back, the room went silent. The sample was small, extremely small, but intact, enough to attempt a partial profile. Dubois felt her pulse jump for the first time since reopening the case. Not because the mystery was solved, but because the case had a pulse again. It wasn't dead. It wasn't forgotten. It wasn't lost in the past. A human trace had survived 40 years of dust, decay, and storage. A trace from the same hands that took Marlene from her family. She gave the order without hesitation. Run the profile, upload it, every second counts. The lab moved quickly. Machines hummed, screens flickered, data processed. For the first time since 1981, the case wasn't frozen in silence. For the first time, the story was moving again. The partial DNA profile entered the system late on a quiet Tuesday evening. It wasn't a full profile, not even close, but it was enough for CODIS to analyze, compare, and search through millions of records. Dubois stood beside the technician as the upload bar filled slowly, watching the blue progress line crawl forward with a kind of tension she couldn't hide. This was the moment every cold case investigator prayed for but rarely received. A living thread that might connect the past to the present. Once the profile was in, all anyone could do was wait. Hours turned into a day turned into several. The team kept working on other cases, but the Foster file stayed open on a separate screen. Every time someone walked past it, they paused, hoping to see an alert, hoping for a match, hoping for something that would finally force the darkness of 1981 to give up its hold. By the second week, doubt crept in. Partial profiles often returned nothing. Even a perfect match wasn't guaranteed to be in the database. Dubois wouldn't admit it out loud, but she felt the weight of all the years this family had carried. She didn't want to add another disappointment to that list. But on a Thursday morning, everything changed. The screen flashed. CODIS returned a hit. Not a direct match, but a familial match. Someone in the system shared enough genetic markers to indicate a blood connection to the person who left skin cells on Marlene's bicycle. A line connecting the present to the crime they had spent decades trying to understand. The room froze. The tech leaned closer. Dubois didn't breathe for several seconds. It wasn't a name yet, but it was a doorway, a link, a path forward that no one had managed to uncover in 40 years. This was the moment families of missing children pray for, the moment most never get. And this is where your viewers must feel the weight of that reality. Guilt-tripping CTA number 2. If you're watching this and you still haven't subscribed, understand this. Most cold cases never get a moment like this. Most families never get a break. If you walk away without supporting the channel that tells their stories, ask yourself why their fight for answers matters less to you than a simple click. Stay with us. Don't disappear when the truth finally shows itself. Back in the lab, Dubois steadied herself. The match wasn't the end. It was the beginning. With this link, they could build out a family tree, narrow relatives, trace locations, and hunt for the one person whose DNA echoed through that degraded sample. For the first time since 1981, the investigation wasn't fighting the dark alone. They had a direction, a bloodline, a trail that could finally lead somewhere real. The breakthrough felt like a spark lighting a room long covered in dust, and Dubois was ready to follow it wherever it led. The moment the familial match came back, Detective Dubois called her team into the conference room. The atmosphere shifted the second everyone sat down. They all knew what this meant. For 4 decades, investigators had been staring into a void. Now, for the first time, they had something tangible, a living relative whose DNA brushed up against the truth. On the screen, the system displayed a name, Preston Hawthorne. His DNA wasn't tied to any violent offenses. Instead, he was in the system for a minor conviction from years earlier. Nothing about him connected directly to Marlene or the events of 1981, but his genetic markers lined up closely enough to indicate he was a first-degree relative to the unknown contributor. Dubois studied his profile: birth year, address history, family connections, known associates. She wasn't looking for guilt. She was looking for proximity. Someone whose relatives might have been in the Lexington area during the summer. Marlene vanished. The deeper they went into the records, the clearer the picture became. Preston had a brother, older, lived closer to Richmond Road in 1981. Quiet, steady employment, no criminal history, no red flags, the kind of background that blended into a town without raising suspicion. His name, Victor Hawthorne. The team exchanged glances, not because the name meant anything yet, but because the circumstances lined up too cleanly to ignore. Victor had lived just a few blocks from the Foster home at the time Marlene went missing, close enough to see the same streets, the same families, the same children riding bicycles after school. Dubois didn't jump to conclusions. She built timelines. She compared addresses. She cross-referenced employment records from the early 80s. The more she read, the more she felt the cold realization that they were circling someone who had watched the search unfold in real time. But none of this was proof. Familial matches only opened the door. They didn't prove who walked through it. The team needed fresh DNA, something current, something irrefutable. They began quiet background checks, surveillance routes, patterns, daily routines. Victor lived a simple life now: grocery store visits, afternoons in his yard, evenings spent quietly at home. He had grown older, his hair gray, his expression mild. To anyone passing him on the sidewalk, He looked like any other aging neighbor who had lived in Lexington too long to cause harm. But Dubois understood better than to trust appearances. Many offenders in cold cases lived out their lives unnoticed, unbothered, blending into the routine of small communities for decades. The team waited for an opening, a chance to obtain something discarded, a cup, a napkin, anything containing DNA. Patience mattered here. One mistake could alert him and send him running. For now, the name was just a possibility, a shadow at the edge of a decades-long tragedy. But the closer they looked, the more the pattern came into focus. Victor Hawthorne wasn't just a name on a screen. He was a path pointing toward the truth waiting beneath 40 years of silence. It took several days of quiet observation before the team got the opportunity they needed. Victor lived a predictable routine, but he wasn't careless. He kept to himself, rarely interacted with neighbors, and didn't linger in public spaces long enough to leave much behind. The officers watching him moved carefully, keeping their distance, understanding that one wrong move after 40 years of silence could cost them everything. Then, one afternoon, Victor walked out of a small diner holding a paper cup. He paused at the entrance, finished the last sip, and tossed it into the outdoor trash bin before heading to his truck. That brief moment, a simple action he probably didn't think twice about, was the break the team had been waiting for. As soon as his vehicle pulled away, a member of the surveillance unit retrieved the discarded cup, sealed it, and rushed it to the lab. Dubois arrived before the sample had even been logged. She didn't want to leave the building. Not this time. Not when the truth was finally within reach. The lab began processing the cup, extracting whatever material they could. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic. It was slow, careful, clinical work. But every second felt like pressure, building behind her ribs. The team gathered in the lab late that evening, watching the tech run the comparison. The computer analyzed both profiles, the degraded DNA from Marlene's bicycle and the freshly extracted DNA from Victor's discarded cup. Numbers filled the screen. Graphs shifted, markers aligned. When the result appeared, no one spoke. The match wasn't partial, it wasn't approximate, it was absolute. Victor Hawthorne's DNA matched the trace found on the bicycle. 40 years of silence collapsed in seconds. Dubois closed her eyes, not in relief, but in anger. Anger for the decades stolen, for the parents who aged without answers, for the community that lived under a quiet shadow they didn't understand. This wasn't just a scientific confirmation. It was a human truth finally forcing its way into the light. Her team knew what came next. Background checks, warrants, coordination with local units, planning an arrest that needed to be controlled and airtight. They had to move with precision, not because Victor was dangerous now, but because justice demanded they do this right. There was no celebration, no cheer, just a heavy collective exhale. The room felt heavier, not lighter, because now they knew exactly who had slipped through the cracks for 4 long decades. A man who went to work, attended gatherings, lived quietly among the same people who once searched desperately for a missing girl he knew would never return home. Dubois walked back to her desk, opened the original Foster file, and placed the lab report beside the first missing flyer from 1981. After all these years, the story finally had a voice again. Not a confession, but a match. Not a name from the past, but a living link to the crime. The DNA didn't reveal a name, but it revealed a bloodline. The breakthrough in the lab didn't end the investigation. It ignited a new one. When Preston Hawthorne's name surfaced through the familial match, the team had to move carefully. His DNA placed him close to the truth, but not inside it. The match suggested a first-degree connection, but Preston himself was far too young in 1981 to have taken Marlene. He hadn't even been born yet. Still, his existence opened a door the case had desperately needed for decades. Detective Dubois studied Preston's family line with the kind of focus that made the room go quiet around her. She wasn't looking for someone suspicious. She was looking for someone who could have quietly blended into Lexington all those years ago. Someone old enough, close enough, and familiar enough with the neighborhood to cross paths with a teenage girl riding home on her bicycle. The Hawthorne family tree was small. Preston had one older sibling, a brother named Victor, born in the mid-1950s. That single detail widened the team's eyes. Victor would have been 27 in 1981, young enough to move unnoticed, old enough to overpower a teenager. And as they discovered through archived property records, he lived just 3 blocks from the Foster home during the time of the disappearance. 3 blocks. That fact alone sent a ripple of unease through the room. Dubois dug deeper. She sifted through old employment documents, utility records, neighborhood directories, anything that could place Victor near Marlene in the months leading up to her disappearance. Every document aligned with the timeline. He was there, quiet, unremarkable. The kind of neighbor who waved politely but left no impression strong enough to remember decades later. The team exchanged cautious looks. They had followed hundreds of leads in their careers, but this was different. This wasn't a rumor or a vague sighting. This was a man whose life intersected with the Foster families without anyone realizing it at the time. Still, Dubois refused to act on assumptions. She needed irrefutable evidence, something that tied Victor to the crime directly, without question, without doubt. That meant doing something the 1981 investigators never could, watching him closely, quietly, waiting for a single careless moment that could expose the truth. A surveillance plan was drafted within hours. Officers rotated shifts, keeping just enough distance to stay invisible. They tracked Victor's movements, noted his routines, and mapped his interactions. Nothing about his behavior suggested guilt. He lived a quiet life, visited the same grocery store each week, maintained his yard, and kept mostly to himself. He looked like any other aging man who had spent decades in the same town. But Dubois knew better than to trust appearances. Too many cold cases had histories filled with faces that seemed harmless. They waited, they watched, and they prepared for the moment he finally slipped. Because deep down, they knew it would come. Victor Hawthorne's daily life moved with the slow rhythm of someone who had lived the same routine for years. Morning coffee on the porch, a short drive to a local hardware store, an occasional stop at the market. He greeted neighbors with a gentle nod, carried himself with calm politeness, and lived like a man who believed the past was fully buried. If someone looked at him without knowing the truth, they would see an ordinary face, a quiet man, a familiar figure in a town that valued familiarity. That was exactly why the surveillance team watched him so closely. They weren't looking for dramatic signs of guilt. They weren't expecting sudden outbursts or suspicious behavior. They were waiting for something simple, a moment when Victor discarded something with his day on it, something the law allowed them to collect quietly, legally, and without alerting him. The kind of break that could move an investigation from suspicion to certainty. Days passed. Officers watched from cars parked a block away, from benches near the grocery store, from the far end of parking lots. Victor moved the same way every day, giving nothing away. No sudden changes, no anxious behavior, no signs that he sensed the walls closing in. Then came the evening that made every hour of waiting worth it. Victor visited a small grocery store just outside town. He walked in alone, bought a few items, and exited with a cold drink in hand. He stood by his truck for a short moment, took a few slow sips, then crushed the empty can slightly and tossed it into a public trash bin before driving off. To anyone else, it was an ordinary gesture, the kind everyone does without a second thought. But for the surveillance team, it was the moment they had been trained to react to. As soon as Victor's truck was out of sight, an officer approached the bin, removed the can with gloved hands, sealed it in an evidence bag, and placed it into a secured case. No celebration, no excitement, just quiet professionalism. They knew how delicate this moment was. One mistake could jeopardize everything. Dineng. The can was rushed to the lab. Dubois was already on her way before the sample even arrived. She didn't smile. She didn't speak much. She refused to let herself feel anything until the results came back. Hope could be dangerous, especially in a case like this. The lab techs moved quickly. They extracted the DNA, ran comparisons, and checked every marker against the degraded sample lifted from Marlene's bicycle. The computer screens filled with data, graphics aligned, numbers tightened. The tension in the room felt like a held breath. Dubois stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the monitor, waiting for confirmation that would finally break 40 years of silence. The comparison was still running, but deep down she could feel it. The truth was moving toward them. The analysis took longer than anyone wanted. Every second the system processed felt stretched thin, pulled tight with years of frustration and unanswered questions. Dubois remained in the lab, arms folded, eyes locked on the monitor as the techs double-checked each step. No one dared interrupt. No one even moved unnecessarily. They all understood the weight of what was happening. Finally, the comparison screen shifted. Lines of data aligned with unmistakable precision. Genetic markers that had been silent for 4 decades finally revealed their truth. When the notification appeared, the room froze around it. Match confirmed, not a partial match, not a statistical suggestion. A definitive match between the DNA from the 1981 bicycle and the DNA extracted from Victor Hawthorne's discarded can. For several seconds, no one spoke. The silence wasn't confusion. It was shock mixed with a kind of exhausted relief, the kind that only comes after fighting for something that felt impossible. Detective Dubois closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight of the moment settle in. She wasn't thinking about the paperwork, the procedures, or the next steps. She was thinking about a girl whose life had been taken long before she ever wore a badge. She was thinking about the parents who had spent 40 years drowning in grief with no explanation. She was thinking about the way this case had become a wound buried in the heart of Lexington. The confirmation didn't bring peace. It brought fury. Because the man who left that day on the bicycle had lived his life untouched. He had watched his neighbors age. He had walked past the same streets where people once searched for the girl he stole. He had become part of the town's scenery while the Foster family lost everything. Dubois placed her hand on the lab table, grounding herself. There was still more to do. They needed warrants, paperwork, coordination with local units. But the truth was settled now. Not a theory, not speculation, not a distant maybe. Victor Hawthorne was the man they had been chasing for 40 years. As the team moved into action, news of the breakthrough spread through the department. Veterans who had been young officers in 1981 stopped in their tracks. Younger officers felt a chill run through them, realizing they were witnessing something rare, something historic. And somewhere in another part of town, retired Detective Elias Vance sat at home when his phone rang. When he heard the words, "We have a confirmed match," his voice cracked. He had carried the failure of this case for most of his career. Now, at last, the darkness had a face. The clock had run out for Victor. His years of quiet living were over, and the team prepared to bring the past directly to his doorstep. The hours following the DNA confirmation felt both urgent and painfully slow. Every detail mattered now. Every piece of paperwork had to be flawless. 40 years of waiting meant there was zero room for error. Dubois gathered her team in the briefing room, and for the first time since the unit was formed, every face carried the same expression, a mix of focus, disbelief, and anger. They reviewed everything: Victor's routine, the safest place to intercept him, the layout of his home, and the distance from nearby houses. They needed an arrest that protected the public, prevented escape, and avoided confrontation. The plan had to be clean, controlled, and precise. As they prepared, Dubois couldn't stop thinking about the contrast between the two lives at play. On one side was Marlene, a young girl whose future had been stolen in a single evening. On the other side was Victor, who had gone on living without consequence, mowing his yard, waving at neighbors, attending church events, aging peacefully while never acknowledging the horror he caused. Every moment of that reality fueled her determination. By dawn, everything was ready. The team moved into position near Victor's home, unmarked vehicles spaced strategically along the street. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of calm morning where people watered their lawns or walked their dogs without fear. None of them knew what was unfolding just a few houses away. None of them knew they were living beside a man whose secret had haunted the town for decades. Victor stepped outside around 7:15 a.m., carrying out the same routine he had followed for years. He walked across his yard with slow, steady steps, completely unaware of what waited around the corner. He didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't sense the shift in the air. He believed the past was buried so deeply that no one could ever reach it. The command was given. Officers emerged from opposite ends of the street, moving with controlled speed. Their vehicles boxed in the driveway before Victor could react. Dubois approached with calm authority, badge raised, her voice steady and unmistakable, as she called his name. Victor Hawthorne, we need you to step forward. For a moment, he just stared at her. Not confused, not angry, just still and as if the truth had finally caught him and he no longer had the strength to outrun it. His expression didn't twist or crumble. It simply collapsed into acceptance. A quiet surrender from a man who knew this day would come eventually. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He didn't ask why. As the cuffs closed around his wrists, decades of false innocence vanished in seconds. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, stunned. The quiet man who had borrowed tools, waved politely, and lived a simple life was being led away by detectives. Some gasped. Others stepped back in disbelief. The mask he had worn for 40 years had fallen, and his arrest became the moment Lexington realized the past had been living among them all along. As the news of Victor Hawthorne's arrest spread through Lexington, the town felt a jolt that ran deeper than shock. People stepped out onto their porches, staring down the street as if waiting for someone to explain how a man they'd lived beside, shopped beside, nodded to at the gas station, had been carrying a truth this horrific. Conversations whispered across fences and in grocery aisles all carried the same disbelief. How could it be him? Neighbors described him as polite, helpful, quiet, a man who shoveled driveways in winter and offered to pick up groceries for anyone who needed it. The kind of person people praised for being dependable, never realizing those same hands had taken a teenager's future and thrown a family into a lifetime of grief. When retired Detective Elias Vance heard of the arrest, he drove straight to the station. He walked through the doors with the weight of 40 years sitting on his shoulders. Officers who recognized him nodded with respect. They all knew what this case had cost him. When he saw the file on the table, open again, alive again, he stopped moving. His jaw tightened, and for the first time in decades, he let out a breath he'd been holding since 1981. It's him, Dubois told him quietly. Vance didn't answer. His eyes glistened, and he nodded once, a nod that carried pain, relief, anger, and gratitude all at once. Meanwhile, as Victor sat handcuffed inside the interrogation room, he remained emotionless. He didn't deny anything. He didn't protest. He didn't ask for explanations. Years of hiding had swallowed whatever reaction he might have once had. He looked almost detached, as though he had finally accepted the truth he'd kept buried for so long. Investigators watched him closely, searching for flickers of remorse, fear, defiance, anything. But Victor gave them nothing. Silence became his final shield. Marlene's parents were informed later that afternoon. They were older now, fragile from years of unanswered questions. When officers arrived at their home, her mother's hands trembled before they even spoke. The moment the words left Dubois's mouth, "We have identified the man responsible," her knees buckled. Her father stood behind her, gripping the edge of a table to steady himself, as grief and relief collided in a single heartbreaking moment. The answers they had begged for had finally arrived, but nothing could return the years stolen from them. Nothing could bring back their daughter. Across the community, realization settled in. The man who had joined neighborhood watch meetings, who walked the same sidewalks everyone trusted, had been hiding in plain sight. He had listened as people discussed Marlene's disappearance. He had watched parents hold their children closer. He had lived comfortably beneath the weight of a secret that crushed everyone else. The truth had survived 4 decades of silence, locked inside a tiny fragment of DNA clinging to an old bicycle handle. Victor Hawthorne's life of lies had finally collapsed. 40 years of hiding, undone by a single cell. The days after Victor's arrest moved with a heaviness that settled over Lexington like a thick fog. His quiet home, once just another house on a peaceful street, now sat behind police tape, watched by reporters and neighbors who could barely process what they were witnessing. For decades, people had assumed the truth died long ago. Now it was walking into a courthouse under guard, wearing handcuffs that seemed almost symbolic. 40 years too late, but necessary all the same. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Families who once remembered Marlene as a bright teenager now sat with gray hair, stiff joints, and hearts that had carried grief for most of their lives. Each step toward the courtroom doors was slow, deliberate, as if they were carrying the weight of every unanswered question they had ever asked. Her mother clutched a small framed photo of Marlene, refusing to let it leave her hands. Her father walked beside her, steadying her with a trembling grip. Victor was brought in under heavy escort. His expression was blank, unreadable, not defiant, not remorseful, not confused, just empty, as if decades of silence had drained whatever emotion once lived behind his eyes. His stillness unsettled everyone in the room. You could feel people leaning back slightly, as if proximity alone felt wrong. The opening statements struck like blows. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, the evidence, the DNA match that left no room for doubt. They spoke of the bike found in the woods, the decades lost, the nights Marlene's parents spent waiting for answers that never came. Each detail reopened wounds so deep they never truly healed. When the prosecutor mentioned the DNA, a trace of skin left behind, forgotten by the man who tried to erase himself from the scene, a hush swept over the courtroom. This wasn't abstract anymore. It was physical, human, undeniable. Victor's defense offered little. They referenced age, memory gaps, and the difficulty of reconstructing events from 40 years ago. But the truth stood in the DNA profile. The room felt it, the jury felt it, and Victor, sitting motionless at the defense table, didn't offer even a flicker of disagreement. He watched the proceedings as if they belonged to someone else. During one recess, Marlene's parents walked past him slowly, guided by an officer. Victor kept his eyes down. For the first time since his arrest, a shift appeared. Not fear, not panic, but a moment of recognition. A brief acknowledgement that the two people whose lives he shattered were standing only feet away. He didn't speak. He didn't apologize. But the way he lowered his head carried a heaviness that suggested he finally understood the weight of what he had done. The courtroom doors closed again, sealing everyone inside a battle between truth and the years that tried to hide it. For Lexington, the trial wasn't just about guilt. It was about finally confronting the horror that had lived quietly among them. The prosecution's case deepened with every witness they called. Former officers who had worked the original investigation took the stand, their voices low, their memories sharp in the places that mattered. They spoke about the search efforts, the abandoned bicycle, the unbearable silence that followed every lead. Some paused mid-sentence, swallowing the emotion that rose with memories they had fought to bury. Even after 40 years, it still hurt. Not just because they failed to find Marlene, but because they had unknowingly walked past the man responsible more times than they could count. Neighbors were next. Their testimonies weren't about evidence, but about shock. Some said Victor was quiet and kept to himself. Others remembered him offering to help with small chores or waving politely from across the street. A few described him as pleasant, an unsettling reminder of how easily someone can blend into a community while hiding unimaginable truth. When asked if they ever suspected him, every single witness gave the same answer: no. Marlene's parents listened with tears streaming down their faces, their hands intertwined tightly. Each statement about Victor's kindness felt like another blow. It wasn't enough that he took their daughter. He had lived comfortably all these years, surrounded by people who trusted him. That betrayal cut deeper than any single act. Later, the prosecution introduced the forensic specialists, the people responsible for uncovering what decades tried to erase. The lab director explained how the synthetic thread was found inside the bicycle seat covering, describing it as the kind of detail older technology couldn't detect. Another specialist walked the jury through the extraction of the degraded sample on the handlebar grip, explaining how rare it was for something so delicate to survive for so long. When the DNA comparison chart was displayed, the room leaned forward in collective anticipation. Marker by marker, the lines aligned, a genetic echo from 1981 connecting directly to the sample taken from Victor's discarded can. The room went still. It wasn't emotional testimony. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't memory. It was science. Cold, clear, final. Victor's attorney tried to undermine the evidence, questioning the storage history of the bike, the chain of custody, the probability rates. The effort was shaky, forced, lacking conviction. Everyone in that courtroom could see it. The defense wasn't arguing innocence. They were arguing distance, time, decay. But the truth refused to bend under those attempts. Then came the moment no one expected. Victor's sister was called to testify, a woman in her 60s now with a worn expression that carried the strain of years she didn't talk about. She didn't defend her brother, but she didn't condemn him either. Instead, she spoke about the summer of an '81, how Victor had grown distant, restless, unsettled, how there were mornings he left the house early without explanation, how she remembered him coming home once with dirt on his clothes and refusing to answer her questions. Her voice shook as she spoke, not out of fear of the courtroom, but out of the pain of realizing she had lived beside a truth she never recognized. Her final words silenced the room. "I wish I paid more attention. Maybe things would have been different." Her sentence echoed with guilt that wasn't hers to carry, but one the entire community felt. As the trial continued, the emotional strain on Marlene's parents became painfully clear. Every day they entered the courtroom, they seemed to age a little more, not physically, but under the weight of memories they had spent decades trying to survive. They had waited so long for justice that the reality of facing the man responsible felt surreal. It was as if time had folded in on itself, forcing them to relive the night their daughter vanished. On the third week of testimony, Marlene's mother was finally asked to take the stand. She walked up slowly, gripping the railing with trembling hands. The courtroom held its breath as she sat down, her framed photo of Marlene resting in her lap. When asked to describe who her daughter was, her voice cracked on the very first word. "She was good," she whispered. "She was kind. She loved animals. She loved life." Every sentence felt like a struggle, pulled from a place of pain that had never healed. She spoke about the night Marlene didn't come home, how she waited by the window until sunrise, praying she would hear the bicycle roll up the driveway. She described the moment the police found the bicycle in the woods, how it felt like someone had torn the world out from under her feet. The jury wiped tears. Even the judge paused for a moment before continuing. Her father followed. He spoke less, but his silence carried its own weight. When asked what the last 4 decades had done to him, he didn't talk about anger or hatred. He talked about emptiness, about the birthdays that passed uncelebrated, the holidays that felt incomplete, the way he walked past Marlene's room every morning hoping, just for a second, that he might hear her voice again. Victor never looked at them while they spoke. He kept his gaze fixed on the table, hands folded in front of him. Whether it was shame, avoidance, or something colder, no one in the courtroom could tell. But the absence of reaction only stirred more questions. How could someone sit so still in the face of the lives they shattered? Outside the courthouse, Lexington struggled with its own emotional conflict. Some residents felt overwhelming relief, a sense of long-awaited closure. Others were stunned, unable to reconcile the quiet man they knew with the darkness now tied to his name. Conversations spilled out across coffee shops, porches, and church hallways. "How did none of us see it? He lived right here, all this time. What else did we miss?" For the first time, the community faced the hard truth. This wasn't random. It wasn't distant. It wasn't the work of a stranger passing through. It was one of their own. The question that began to surface, spoken quietly, fearfully, was one that would echo through every household. If someone like him could do this, who else have we trusted for too long? As witnesses cycled through the courtroom, another thread of the story began to emerge, one that made Lexington deeply uncomfortable. People weren't just shocked by Victor's guilt. They were shaken by the realization that he had lived among them for decades without raising suspicion. The deeper investigators dug, the more they uncovered moments that felt haunting in hindsight. A former neighbor recalled how Victor once offered to help fix a broken fence. She remembered thinking he was unusually quiet but polite. A retired school teacher said she occasionally saw him walking near the bus stop in the early '80s, smoking a cigarette as children passed by. No one ever thought twice about it back then. It was a small town. People didn't fear each other. They trusted familiar faces. Now those same memories felt like warning signs no one recognized. The prosecution highlighted this pattern, not to blame the community, but to show how easy it was for a person to hide behind routine. This wasn't a case built on horror movie theatrics, it was ordinary. That was what made it so devastating. Evil didn't come into Lexington wearing a mask or shouting threats. It came quietly, steadily, calmly. It blended in, shook hands, smiled politely, and waited for the right moment. That realization sank into everyone in the courtroom, settling in their limbs like cold weight. Detective Dubois sat behind the prosecution table, taking notes, but every so often her gaze lifted to observe the jury. She could see it in their eyes, the dawning understanding that this case wasn't just about Marlene. It was about the fragility of trust, the cracks in assumptions, the danger of believing danger always looks dangerous. During one particularly emotional testimony, an elderly man who had lived near the Fosters in 1981 took the stand. He spoke softly, his hands shaking slightly. "I remember seeing him at the community meetings after she went missing," he said, referring to Victor. "He sat right there with the rest of us, acted worried, asked questions. He even helped search one night." The room fell silent. That single sentence felt like a blade. Victor had helped search for the girl he took. He had stood beside grieving neighbors, shining his flashlight into woods he already knew held no answers. The betrayal ran deeper than the crime itself. It wasn't just violence. It was deception woven into daily life, a lie he sustained comfortably while the town collapsed under grief. People inside the courtroom exchanged glances, visibly shaken. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others covered their mouths. A few cried quietly into their hands. It wasn't just that Victor had committed the crime. It was that he had lived through the aftermath with no visible remorse. It was that he had allowed others to carry guilt, fear, and blame while he carried nothing. Even the judge paused before proceeding, giving the courtroom a moment to absorb the testimony. For Marlene's parents, this new revelation shattered whatever pieces of normalcy remained. Her mother, already fragile from the emotional weight of the trial, pressed a tissue to her face as her shoulders trembled. Her father closed his eyes, jaw tight, as if trying to block out the image of Victor walking beside them during those desperate nights, pretending to be part of the search. The entire town felt the same question rising inside them, a question sharper than fear. How could someone hide the truth for 40 years and still look their neighbors in the eyes? As the trial moved toward its final days, the weight inside the courtroom felt almost physical. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every quiet moment of reflection had stripped away the layers of normalcy Victor used to shield himself for 40 years. The jury had watched a portrait of a man unravel through timelines, science, and the devastating memories of those who lived near him. Now all that remained was the verdict and the emotional reckoning no one could escape. Closing arguments struck deeply. The prosecution spoke with measured force, reminding the jury that this case wasn't complicated anymore. The DNA told the truth. The timelines aligned. The silence Victor carried for 4 decades was louder than any confession. They described how Marlene's innocence had been stolen, how her parents had endured a lifetime of fear and heartbreak, and how the community had been forced to live with a wound that never healed. When the defense stood, their argument felt thin. They pointed to Victor's age, the difficulty of recalling details from 1981, and the possibility of contamination across decades. But these claims lacked conviction. The evidence had spoken too clearly. The jury could see it, everyone could. Then the courtroom was dismissed temporarily, leaving families, officers, and townspeople pacing the hallways in tense silence. Marlene's parents sat together on a bench, holding hands. Her mother traced the edge of her daughter's photo with a trembling finger. Her father stared at the floor, his jaw locked in a way that revealed the storm inside him. They were moments away from hearing words that would change their lives again, this time with truth instead of doubt. When the jury finally returned, the room fell silent. Every seat was filled. Reporters leaned forward. Some neighbors cried preemptively. Even Victor looked different, not nervous, but resigned, as if he finally understood that the years he had hidden behind were no longer enough to shield him. The judge asked the foreperson to rise. The pause that followed was long enough to make hearts pound. On the charge connected to the disappearance of Marlene Foster, We find the defendant, Victor Hawthorne, guilty. The word hit the room like a shockwave. Marlene's mother collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing into his shoulder. Her father, who had held himself together for most of the trial, broke down silently beside her. Officers who had worked the case decades ago wiped away tears. Even strangers in the gallery covered their mouths, overwhelmed by the sound of a truth they had waited nearly a lifetime to hear. But as the room absorbed the verdict, a darker realization crept in, one that carried a warning no one wanted to acknowledge. He lived among them for 40 years because too many people convinced themselves danger couldn't be close, because too many stayed silent, because too many looked away. Guilt-tripping CTA number 3. If you've followed this story to this point and you still haven't subscribed, ask yourself why silence feels easier than support. Stories like this get forgotten when people turn away. Don't be that person. If you refuse to subscribe, at least go to the comments and tell us why. Because silence is exactly how men like Victor stay hidden. As Victor was taken from the courtroom, the air shifted. It wasn't celebration. It was relief, raw and trembling. A 40-year weight lifted, not completely, but enough for the first real breath in decades. For the first time since 1981, Lexington exhaled. In the days that followed the verdict, Lexington felt different. The sunlight looked the same, the streets were unchanged, and life resumed its familiar rhythm. Yet an invisible weight had finally shifted. For decades, the town had carried the unspoken fear that the truth would remain buried forever. Now that the person responsible had been held accountable, people struggled to understand what healing was supposed to feel like. Outside the courthouse, members of the community gathered in small groups, sharing stories about where they were in 1981, what they remembered, and how the disappearance had shaped their childhoods and parenthoods. Some spoke softly, still afraid to let their voices rise. Others spoke with anger. Anger toward Victor, toward themselves, towards the silence that allowed him to blend into their world without consequence. Even now, long after the verdict, the disbelief lingered. Retired Detective Elias Vance became a quiet figure in these conversations. People approached him gently, offering handshakes or simple nods of gratitude. He didn't seek attention. He didn't speak at length. But every once in a while, when someone thanked him for never giving up, his eyes softened. The guilt he carried for 40 years didn't disappear with the verdict, but something inside him eased. A long-held promise had finally been honored. As for Marlene's parents, the aftermath brought a strange, painful shift. Justice delivered a truth they had begged for, yet it didn't fill the empty chair at their dinner table or bring back the voice they replayed in their memories every night. They grieved all over again, not because the verdict hurt, but because it reminded them of everything they lost. Their daughter's life would never move forward, and knowing who took her didn't erase the years of waiting, hoping, and praying. Still, a new kind of silence settled into their home, one without torment, one without unanswered questions. It wasn't peace, but it was something close to clarity. And after 40 years, that small shift mattered. Across the town, people revisited their memories of Victor. Every moment now carried a different meaning. The polite nods, the quiet routines, the seemingly harmless habits. They wondered how they missed the clues. They questioned their own instincts. They replayed old encounters with a sense of unease. It wasn't just guilt, it was fear. The kind that whispers that danger doesn't always come from strangers. The kind that reminds people that trust can be misplaced, even in the places they consider safest. In community meetings, parents asked for stronger protections, better systems, and quicker responses to missing person reports. The local media covered police training changes, new forensic investments, and neighborhood initiatives to ensure nothing like this could ever slip through unnoticed again. Lexington wasn't trying to forget, it was trying to learn. Standing outside the courthouse one evening, Detective Dubois looked out across the parking lot as the sun set. The gold light hit the building in a soft glow, and she felt the weight of everything that had unfolded. The years lost, the pain uncovered, the truth finally brought into the open. She knew this case would stay with her forever. Cases like this always did, but for the first time since she reopened the file, she felt something steady rise inside her. Not triumph, not relief, but a quiet resolve. Justice had taken 40 years, but it had arrived, and Lexington, for the first time in decades, could finally stand without the shadow that once held it down. The aftermath of the trial didn't just close a chapter in Lexington, it forced the entire state of Kentucky to confront the cracks in its system. For years, older cases had sat untouched because the tools simply didn't exist to revisit them properly. Marlene's case, solved after 40 long years, became a turning point officials could no longer ignore. Lawmakers, detectives, and forensic specialists all agreed if one case could be revived by a single preserved object and a fragment of DNA, then countless others deserve the same chance. Meetings were held across the state. Cold case units that once operated on limited resources suddenly became central topics of conversation. The Foster case proved what families had been pleading for, that time shouldn't be a reason to give up, and technology should never sit idle when answers still exist. What happened in Lexington became a catalyst. Funding proposals were drafted, including grants for new forensic equipment and statewide training on evidence preservation. Some communities even began lobbying for dedicated genealogical analysts to help with cases that had stalled for decades. The impact rippled outward. Parents whose children had been missing for years wrote letters to law enforcement, asking if their loved ones' cases could be reviewed under the new programs. Organizations that supported families of the missing spoke openly about the hope Marlene's case restored, not because the ending was easy, but because it finally proved that too old didn't have to mean unsolvable. Detective Dubois was invited to speak at several panels about the importance of reviewing older evidence with modern tools. Each time she carried Marlene's flyer with her, not for display, but for grounding, for reminding herself and everyone listening that justice wasn't theoretical. It had a face, a name, a family, and it demanded persistence even when decades stood in the way. What happened to Marlene reshaped more than a file number. It reshaped how Kentucky viewed responsibility to its past. Even with statewide reforms underway, the heart of this story remained with Marlene's family. The verdict had given them clarity, but it did not return the years they lost or the daughter they loved. Their home, once filled with her laughter and the energy of a teenager planning her future, now held decades of quiet resilience. Justice had come, but healing was more complicated. Healing required time they could never recover. Her mother often sat by the window where she once waited for Marlene to come home. Now she sat there simply because it felt like the only place where her daughter's memory stayed close. Her father spent long afternoons in the backyard repairing things that didn't need fixing. Small acts that helped him stay grounded when emotion threatened to overwhelm him. They moved through their days knowing the truth, but also knowing that truth didn't erase grief. Still, something inside their home had shifted. The unanswered questions that once filled every corner had finally fallen silent. The photos on the wall felt less like unanswered pleas and more like reminders of a life that, though cut short, was finally honored with truth. Friends and neighbors brought food, shared stories, and sat with them in the quiet moments when words weren't needed. No one pretended healing was finished, but everyone understood that closure didn't mean forgetting. Across Lexington, families began talking differently. Parents who once trusted familiar streets without hesitation now discussed safety with their children in careful, honest ways. People who had lived in the same neighborhoods for decades admitted they sometimes looked at familiar faces with new awareness. Not fear, but understanding. They realized that danger doesn't always come from distant places or unfamiliar shadows. The town learned a hard truth. Silence can hide anything, even someone who lives only a few houses away. Marlene's story became part of Lexington's identity, not as a tragedy to fear, but as a reminder that communities must stay vigilant, involved, and willing to question what they once believed impossible. As the months passed after the trial, the story of Marlene Foster became more than a case file. It became a mirror held up to the people of Lexington. The town that once believed nothing truly dangerous could touch them now understood that time does not protect anyone, and the past is never too far behind to reach forward again. Families who once locked their doors casually now did so with intention. Community meetings filled with people who wanted to understand, who wanted to protect, and who wanted to make sure no child vanished into silence ever again. Schools began teaching awareness programs. Neighborhood watch groups reorganized. Churches opened their doors for conversations about vigilance and accountability. The community didn't want fear to define them. They wanted responsibility to guide them. People who once hesitated to speak up about unusual behavior now found their voices. Not out of paranoia, but from understanding that tragedy grows easiest where assumptions go unchallenged. Detective Dubois returned often to the Fosters' home to check on them, not as an officer, but as someone forever connected to the story that changed her life. She admitted privately that she still thought about the bicycle in evidence storage, the fragment of DNA that survived against all odds, and the 40 years that stood between a crime and its truth. The case had taught her something she would carry into every future investigation. There is no such thing as too late for justice. In quiet moments, when Lexington settled under the glow of streetlights, you could feel the town breathing differently. Not with fear, but with awareness. Not with defeat, but with resolve. Marlene's memory became a reminder that innocence is fragile, that communities must guard their own, and that truth, no matter how long it waits, deserves to be found. Her story will always linger in Lexington, not as a ghost, but as a promise.